and you'll be put on mute, and your video will be off during the presentation. There will hopefully be some opportunities for questions. So if you do have some questions, please put them in the Q&A box, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. And hopefully for each presentation, we'll have some time to answer those questions. And depending on how many questions we have, will be how we actually get round or are able to answer them. The three presentations today all highlight the importance of traceability. And so with that in mind, I'll hand over to Barbie, who will introduce our first speaker.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for joining. I apologize, my lighting situation doesn't seem to be working very well right now, but I'm able to see you, and hopefully you're able to see me. So thank you so much for joining today, and it's a pleasure today and always to be with you to talk about hemovigilance topics of interest. In particular, the topic today is traceability, and we all know how important that is and how many different aspects of it continue to affect our blood safety. Our first speaker is Paul Ashford, and Paul has been involved in traceability for many years. He was the executive director of the ICCBBA, the international, he's going to have to do the acronym for me, but from 2005 to 2021. And prior to that, he worked for the Welsh Blood Service in UK as a clinical scientist and as a head of information technology. He's now retired from full-time work, but you never know it because I see him on many, many calls and activities. He continues to do some consulting and carry out volunteer activities with both ISBT and the UK Science Council. Over the years, he's contributed to the development of numerous standards and guidelines for a range of organizations, including the World Health Organization, AABB, ISBT, ICCBBA, and the British Society of Hematology. He was the lead author for the ISBT guideline on traceability and is currently developing electronic messages to support transfusion and transplantation as part of the HL7 FHIR, Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, I know that acronym, FHIR Orders and Observations Work Group. And it's a pleasure to introduce Paul, and I know that you'll really enjoy his presentation. So welcome, Paul, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Barbie, for that introduction. And I'm delighted that IHN has put forward this topic of traceability for a webinar because it is such an important area. So I will just share my screen.
We can see your screen. Thank you.
That is now visible. Okay, great. So yes, the topic is traceability. I'm going to focus on. I'm going to be talking about the ISB standard guideline on traceability. But I just thought I would start off by reminding ourselves of the importance of traceability. It's traceability is part of the infrastructure that we build hemovigilance and patient safety activities on. We need it to mitigate patient harm due to transfusion-transmitted disease because we must be able to get back to identify the donor and all the donations from that donor. We need to be able to locate and quarantine products in stock and identify recipients of products. We also need it as follow-up for adverse reactions in recipients. We need to track that to find out what happened and try and find a cause behind the reactions. On the larger picture, we need it as a way of performing lookbacks and analysing archive information. That might be research associated with newly identified infections or product recall, but we need also to be able to link cause and effect. So when we have an effect in a patient, we want to find out the cause. We often need to track back the donor. And finally, litigation. We need to sometimes in court be able to prove what we did and how we did it and what the outcome of the results were. But the challenge really facing traceability is that it's very often assumed. People say, well, we've got an IT system and that keeps records, therefore we've got traceability. It's often not clearly owned. So we don't know necessarily if there's an individual in the organisation that's responsible for the overall responsibility for traceability. Does it lie with IT? Does it lie with the quality department? Or is it operations? Because of that lack of clear ownership, it's often inadequately resourced, both in terms of the expertise in traceability and plans and finance put in to ensure that it's effective and efficient. There's also often a short-term focus. People just look at what we've just done. The blood that we collected 2 months ago and transfused a few weeks ago, can we trace it? And if we can, then that's great. But we know that this has to be on a long-term basis, and we'll be talking about the timescales later. And it's not just about the current situation. You need to ensure your traceability is intact for many years. And one of the other challenges is we rarely see it being audited. Even within an organisation, traceability specifically is often not audited. And bearing in mind that the traceability pathway often runs through organisations, it's extremely rare to see it actually audited right the way from patient back to donor and from donor to recipient. So those are the challenges we face in trying to ensure that we have effective traceability. Recognising that and the importance of traceability, the ISBT Working Party on Information Technology decided that it would be a good idea to prepare a guideline on traceability for medical products of human origin, obviously including blood and cell therapy products. And that was published last year, and I would recommend it to you. I'm just going to be highlighting some aspects of it, but it's really important that this document is used as a tool to assess traceability in your own organisation. Before I get into the detail, I just want to remind people about the fact that traceability is not only important, but it is very often regulated. And I'm using the EU regulation as an example, but many countries have a requirement for traceability as a regulatory requirement. And the highlighting in this is mine, so I just wanted to bring out the fact that it talks about unambiguous identification, which means you have to have unique identifiers across all of the products that are in the context of where the regulation applies, and the need to be able to trace to the donor and to the recipient, which means bi-directionally. Wherever you are in the traceability chain, you must be able to go backwards to where it started from with the donor and go forwards to where it ended with the recipient. The other point I want to bring out about from the regulation is the timescale. I talked about this. It is long term. And in EU now, there is a minimum requirement for 30 years retention of traceability data. And interestingly, they've added in the wording in the new regulation to say appropriately safeguarded and accessible, which is really important. You can't just push it away in a corner and say, well, we've got the records there. You have to protect them and you have to make them accessible. The other thing they've added into the regulation, the recent regulation, is this statement about what happens when an organisation ceases activity. So you have an organisation that holds traceability records, but is going to go out of business. There is an obligation to ensure that responsibility is passed to another licensed entity to ensure that the traceability chain isn't compromised. So this is just a question for you to think about. I'm not asking for answers, but just for you to ponder. Let's think about a donation of blood that was collected in your country in 2010, so 14, 15 years ago. How confident are you that today it will be possible to trace all the recipients and the donor and all the recipients of the products prepared from that donation? How long do you think it would take? Could you do it immediately? Would it take days or weeks, maybe even months? And are your answers to those questions based on evidence from actual lookbacks, or is it something that's just a gut reaction because there isn't really anywhere to look? And this sort of highlights some of the challenges we've got in this long-term retention that we're required to provide. So the challenges we face with traceability, it must be bi-directional. It has to be able to go back to the donor, forwards to the recipient. And that's quite unusual in traceability as in the broader context. When we talk about traceability in a broader context, it tends to be one way. So if you buy meat at butchers, you might expect to be able to trace back to the farm and to the herd where that meat came from, but you wouldn't expect to be able to start with the herd and identify all the people who ate the meat. That's not part of the traceability path. Traceability is for medical products, human origin, for blood, is multi-organisational in many situations. In some cases, one organisation is responsible for everything from donation right the way through to clinical application. But more generally, there'll be at least a blood centre and a hospital transfusion laboratory involved, and there may be others. And that means that there has to be interfaces between organisations. One organisation has to point to another one where the product went. And when you think about a 30-year time period, there's going to be changes in organisations. There will be mergers, takeovers, restructurings, closures. And how do those interfaces get managed to ensure that they're still effective all over through that time period? The other challenges for long time periods, particularly with most records moving on to IT systems, the technology obsolescence, attrition of skills and knowledge of the people who are able to actually use the old system, use the systems that are holding the information, and therefore the needs for data migration or archiving. And I'll talk more about those later. Traceability can't exist on its own, or effective traceability can't exist on its own. It needs some prerequisites. So you need to ensure you've got an effective quality management system. You need an information management plan that looks at where information is held, how traceability is ensured, and it needs to be regularly updated, recognizing that things change over time. There should be a procedure within the quality system for traceability. Now, a lot of procedures may refer to traceability at various steps, but it's important to have an overarching procedure for traceability. There needs to be training and competency assessment in traceability, and there needs to be audit. The procedure for traceability, the overarching procedure, should identify the regulatory context you're working in. It should identify who has overall responsibility for traceability. It should identify and show the pathways for traceability and the interfaces between organisations. It needs to describe how often you review the system and how you perform risk assessment. It needs to show how you report and investigate traceability failures, and it needs to link in to your security and data protection procedures. Now, we talked about this time period and the fact of legacy, what I call legacy data, because over 30 years, IT systems change, and you would expect to see probably 2 or even 3 system changes over that length of time. So you have to decide what you're going to do with the information held on those old systems. There are 3 main options. One is you do data migration. You take all of the all the traceability records off your old system and you move it to the new system. Or you say, we're going to take all the records off this old system and put them on in a data warehouse, which just holds the information for lookup purposes, but is not part of the new system. Or we'll retain our legacy system, we'll keep it running, and we'll use it for look back only. Now, one of the problems when you're looking at this is at the time you're carrying out this assessment, the cost of data migration for old to new system is very high. It involves a lot of work being done on both systems. The transfer to a data warehouse might be less expensive, and there's an assumption that retaining the old system, just switching it off and putting it to one side and you can be able to bring it back up when you need it, is the cheapest option. But you then need to think about the fact that you do need to maintain system security. So that old system can't just stay as an old system. It's got to be managed to ensure it's secure, both physically and from an IT perspective. You need to keep the knowledge and the skills to use it. So staff have got to be competent, and they need to be reminded, so they probably need to run the system on a regular basis. And you need to ensure that that system, although it's only for lookup, is in compliance with your privacy and confidentiality legislation. And all of that together can actually mean that in the long term, retaining your legacy systems becomes a high cost option. One of the other topics we describe in the guideline is about traceability audit. And we talk about the various questions that you should be asking, and I've identified some of them here. I'm just going to focus on 2. Is traceability regularly tested? And going back to a point I made earlier, it's not just about the unit you bled last month or last year. You should be checking as part of your audit, can we still track back right to the beginning? Most organisations haven't got 30 years of data since the regulation came in, but there's at least 15 to 20 years you should be able to go back and show that you still have traceability. And are your old systems, the systems you're not running routinely, but you're just there in order to do lookup, are they compliant with data protection and security and confidentiality requirements? That's, I think, a really important thing, because people have got old systems which they've had for a number of years and they are using for lookup, and it's a big challenge to make sure those are brought within the security and data protection requirements. So that's covered the work we've done on the ISBT guideline, and as I said, it's quite a brief summary of just some of the major points. But before I finish, I'd like to talk about the next step and what we're working on currently with electronic messaging, because that is going to become an extremely important part of how we ensure that final step in traceability is improved. So at the present time, traceability records tend to end at the hospital transfusion lab. That supports donor to patient traceability, because you can go from the donor through the blood centre to the transfusion lab, and they have records about patients who received the product. Obviously, it's more challenging if the patient has moved or changed their name to actually track them down. But the problem is when you come from going the other way, you start with a patient or an individual, and you need to track back to the donor. And particularly if it's been over a long period of time that you're needing to trace. You've got to know, has the person received transfusions? And that's going to rely possibly on the memory of the individual or on local clinical records. But obviously if they receive the transfusion somewhere distant, that you're not going to know that. And it can be difficult to identify transfusions in different locations. People have to remember where they were treated in order to be able to find that link, that initial link to get the traceability pathway backwards. What we're seeing worldwide now is the move towards electronic health records. And there's a huge amount of difference in the way those records have developed and are being implemented. But the idea the progression is towards a record that is individual and can travel with the person and has the potential to link to all the information on all previous clinical procedures. Now, systems themselves are very different and the way they store information is different. But what is happening internationally now is there's convergence on an interoperability standard. That means a standard that says, however you store the information, I can ask you for it in a particular way and it will come back in the same format wherever it's coming from. And the standard that everyone is converging towards is called FHIR, Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resource, which is part of the HL7 standard. Now, up until fairly recently, transfusion information was not readily accommodated by FHIR, and therefore it wasn't readily suited to go into the electronic health record. But what we're doing now is to work on modifying the FHIR resource. With one of the FHIR resources is one called biologically derived products, to make it suitable for medical products of human origin and blood. And we've also identified an existing resource within FHIR called the procedure resource as suitable for recording transfusion events. Now, by starting to move towards using those two resources, we will be able to support the information from the electronic health record to the transfusion event and the products used. And that also be able to link to outcome and adverse event information. So it's a potentially hugely powerful way of us being able to improve access to transfusion information within hospitals. Just the existing mechanism then, the electronic health record, references procedures within FHIR and those reference products used. And we're leveraging that so that the electronic health record can point to specifically to transfusion procedures, and those can reference the blood products. What that means in the long term, we'll be able to start with a patient. That patient, we can access their electronic health record. That will point to all the transfusion procedures for the biologically derived products, which then point back to the supplier of those products, who can then identify the donor. So you get a full traceability pathway in both directions. That brings me to the end of my presentation. I've given you a couple of references here, the ISBT guideline on traceability and a recent paper gives more detail on the FHIR electronic messaging. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Paul. We have a couple of questions. I'm going to take the moderator's opportunity to ask a question first. I'm just wondering, when you talk about the traceability and the FHIR and the idea that the patient would have his or their record in their hands, could with the vision of the HL7 FHIR group, would a patient be able to know the unit number of the blood that they were transfused with, and therefore in 20 years be able to request a trace back if needed?
So the way that this operates is the resources are held by the individual organisations responsible for them. So the electronic health record would have pointers to the procedures that have been carried out. But those procedures live in the hospitals that were responsible for those procedures. The procedures would point to the transfusion blood products, and the information on those blood products would be held by the blood centres or the transfusion laboratory or the blood centres that provided them. So at each point there's security, and it's therefore, although the links are there and the potential is there to trace all the way back, only those authorised at each step will be able to do so.
Thank you. So we have a question. Are the traceability requirements for plasma-derived medicinal products such as albumin and immunoglobulins the same as for blood components?
So that depends very much on the individual country and how their regulation is written. In general, I would say that regulations tend to differ for what we call blood and blood components and the plasma-derived products. And the latter very much often falls under what pharmacovigilance rather than biovigilance. And so the requirements are different, but you do need to look at the regulations for your country because it does vary.
So what role might AI and machine learning play in enhancing traceability systems for substances of human origin?
I'm going to pass on that one because AI is not. I'm retired now.
Great question.
That was too new.
Okay. What are the most common sources of error in the traceability process, and how can these be mitigated?
It would depend, I think, on the type of records you have. I mean, if you're still using manual recording, manual transcription errors potentially are one of the major areas of potential error. With electronic, it's probably going to be more around the long-term storage. You know, it's this: can we still access the old records, the old systems? And we think we can, but if we haven't properly audited them, how can we be sure? So I think it does depend on the type of system you're running to answer that one.
Thank you. How is patient confidentiality balanced with the need for traceability?
That is a big challenge, and I think the answer is, well, the fire solution, once we get to it, is one that should be able to manage that, because the traceability pathway is there, but at every step of going back along the pathway, you should have security in place to ensure that only those who are authorised can have access. But it is a real challenge, I think, to balance those two. And I think that's general with healthcare and information, the need to be able to share information and at the same time to ensure confidentiality.
So I think one more question here. Traceability in our hospital is paper-based. It's kept in a folder for a full year, then taken into storage off-site for 30 years. Should this system be changed? Whose job is it to change it? And I'm the hospital hemovigilance officer. Is that part of my role?
Right. Well, you know, paper-based records do have the advantage that keeping them for 30 years is in many ways much easier than with IT systems. As long as you don't have floods or fire, then the records can be accessed. Obviously, as far as managing, manual records have potential for error, and they are slower. So generally speaking, for efficiency, people move towards IT systems. I think whether it's the right time to change from your manual records to an IT-based system depends an awful lot on other priorities than the level of development of the transfusion service you're working in. And there's a right time, but there can be a wrong time if you try and rush it when you haven't got other things in place. So think about the prerequisites, think about your quality system before you even start trying to move towards IT. IT systems don't fix bad systems. You have to put good systems in place and then automate them. Responsibility is a good question. Is it your responsibility? It's somebody's responsibility. And if the it's not clear within the organisation whose responsibility it is. That's something that should be addressed.
Thanks, Paul. So I'd like to pass, I'd like to say that we will answer any of the questions we haven't gotten to in the Q&A as we're going along. But I'd like to pass this back to my colleague, Simon Benson. Thank you. Thank you, Paul.
All right, thanks, Barbie, and thanks, Paul, for a fantastic presentation. It's a great topic, and now the guideline covers very comprehensively traceability, and I think gives us a good grounding on what we should be looking for. Well, our second speaker, who I'll introduce now, is Dr. Deepak Sadani. Deepak is a transfusion medicine specialist with the New Zealand Blood Service in the Waikato region, based in Hamilton in New Zealand. He's an experienced transfusion medicine physician with over 30 years experience across India, the UK and New Zealand. And Deepak is also a fellow of the UK Royal College of Pathologists and an associate fellow of the Royal College of Pathologists Australasia since 2013. In his current role as a transfusion medicine specialist with NZBS, he is responsible for providing medical leadership to the local Waikato Regional Blood Transfusion Centre and hospital transfusion services of both the base hospital and 8 neighbouring regional hospitals. Deepak is also a member of the hospital transfusion committees in 4 hospitals across the region and works closely in Hamilton with what was one of the first patient blood management teams in New Zealand. The topic of Deepak's presentation is the New Zealand experience with vein-to-vein traceability. So with that in mind, over to you, Deepak.
Thanks, Simon, for the invite and for the kind presentation. Let me start by sharing my presentation. Kia ora, Tina koto katoa. Simon is very kind and still remembers his time in New Zealand, and has still some memories of our systems. So I'll try to take you through those systems that exist since our inception. Just a word about New Zealand. It's a beautiful small country located far, far away with limited...
Just to interrupt, Deepak, sorry, Shruti, just to interrupt, Deepak, you're not sharing your screen?
Okay.
All good.
All right, here we go. Let's start again. Kia ora, tina koto katoa. I'll start by thanking Simon once again and the organizing committee for thinking about New Zealand. We are a small country, as I was saying, with far and limited resources and a small population that can work to our advantage. So New Zealand blood, we'll just go through what the outline is. We'll show you the legacy blood management systems that we had. We will, with an expanding, and changes come through, which were mentioned by Paul, is, we've also had some changes. We've had, updated blood management systems. We look at the donations and transfusions that happen in New Zealand. We look at our look-back criteria, policy and numbers, and I'll briefly talk about how we manage our BACT alert system for platelets. I'll actually take you through a look back case to do a live audit to show you if the system works. And we'll come to the conclusions at the end. So before 1998, the blood services in the country, and we divided into two islands, the North Island and the South Island, were led by a hospital themselves, and they had their own individual blood banks, which numbered about 30. And in an effort to reduce cost and duplication of work, there was a Carter-Marshall report that favored the formation of a New Zealand blood service. It was finally formed in June 1998. And with that, we were also given a vein-to-vein mandate, which involves us being the sole provider and the sole person responsible for actually tracing the units back to everyone in the country. At that time, we merged about 30 individual hospital blood banks under a common computerization system under NZBS. We also run the 6 largest blood banks, and we had 4 processing sites based in Auckland, in Hamilton, in Wellington, and in Christchurch. But we've had now only 3. But we've always had 2 donor accreditation labs. The whole system, New Zealand Blood Service and hospitals, uses a unique 6-digit NHI number, which is the National Health Index identifier for patient identification. And that is used primarily for identifying each patient in the country, everywhere. It involves your GP practice, involves your secondary care, and involves your tertiary care. So that's something that we have unique as a country also. So what did we start off with? Just as an background to this is that the more computerized you are, the better your systems will be. And I think that computerization is central to all modern blood banking processes. So just a word before as a disclaimer is that I don't have shares in the Mac company, and I'm not representing them or recommending them. I'm just showing you what we have. We started off with registering all our donors in 1998 nationally under one system called Progesa. It took a bit of time for us to gear up to put the patient module in, and that was in 2001. And it took us a few more years before it was implemented in all the other 24 blood banks that existed around the country. I've still been told about people who would manually sit and transfer all their files onto the electronic e-Progesa systems, and all the patients were successfully incorporated into that electronic system by 2005. We made an upgrade to e-Progesa, and I'll show you the differences as to what Progesa looked like and what e-Progesa looks like. And then there were limitations also in e-Progesa, so we upgraded in 2017 to eTraceline. So this is on the left, the legacy system that we had, which is Progesa, the good old DOS-based system. And on the right, you can see a window-based system that is on eProgesa. So all our donors are currently registered under one system and have been since 1998. And every upgrade that we do carries on all our data to the next system. So there's nothing left behind. This is some of the screenshots that I could retrieve from the old Progesa site. This is pretty limited in what I can show you, but this is what the patient module looked like. It was pretty basic. And even the e-trace line is not that great. Sorry, e-Progesa wasn't that great. What you're seeing here is the patient registration on the legacy system in Progesa and in what it will look like in eProgesa. So currently, we've had another review a few years ago. There are 4 main regions now that the healthcare has been divided into, and there are 19 individual TIFA 2 districts. And that blood service has also merged with the transplant services and the bone marrow donor registry services. I work in the Midland region, in the Te Manawa Taki region, and I cover about 1.4 million people. So donors are still being managed in eProgesa. The e-trace line operates nationally, and all blood components and tissues are issued in real time using e-trace line. This is nationally supported by our IT teams. We provide the software to all the blood banks in the country, whether they are run by us or by hospitals or by private labs. And we monitor them and provide backups for 24 hours, 365 days. Our systems have now been taken into the cloud. And in fact, we have seen a further reduction in downtimes and in backups that were being done regularly. The manual records are only kept for during outages. Each blood bank has a system that is defined that they will record, and they are input into the e-trace line as soon as the systems are back up and running. So it's not a lot of work that gets generated, and few and far in between outages. So when you log into our systems, we can see both the ends clearly. We can see the blood from whom we have taken, and we can see whom the blood has gone to and which unit has been transfused to which patient in which part of the country. So all this is national, all this is live. We as the vein-to-vein provider, we have got our accesses, granted to be able to check what we need to check, and as the medical specialist, we are allowed to access in real time whatever is being transfused wherever. So I'm happy to share my data as a blood donor. I don't have to take permission from anybody. But this shows, all the blood donations that I have made. It goes further bit down, actually. I think I started in 2013, not as good as a frequent donor as I should be. But this is what my records in eProgesa currently look like on the donor side. And I'll show you a picture next of what the patient side looks like. So if you see, this is what the e-trace line looks like. And if I put in into the components traceability a number on the unit, I can trace back to where the origin of this unit is, where is it located, what were the movements that were recorded before it was even issued to this hospital and to this patient. So if you can see, this inventory, was moved to as a platelet transfusion by delivery to our Waikato blood bank, and the Waikato blood bank then put it in the inventory and then issued it to this patient later in the day, about, I think, 6-7 hours later. And it identifies the form order number, the region, the date and the time, and it will also identify the badge of the person. And what it crucially is identifying is the NHI of this patient and the name of this patient. So we can actually go back very quickly to the hospital and ask how that patient is doing, or look at that information, or ask for that information if we don't have access to that. Similarly, I can log into the patient and see all the products that have been issued to this patient. This is a recent patient that I'm currently treating for TTP with plasma exchanges. And you can see that the platelet pool right at the bottom, that's the one that was transfused to her, but she's receiving all the blood products that she has. And this will remain on the system. Moving on, we will carry our the new upgrades that we will get to eTraceline with all this information. So this is not going to go anywhere. In fact, we are now able to trace back children who were born 30 years ago, had a cord sample sent to us, and they are coming back to us as mothers. And we can create a record and link it to the one that was previously in the system. So it is currently working, and it is something that that works on a day-to-day basis. So how many donations are we doing? We've if you see at this chart, and some of these charts are from our latest hemovigilance reports, I thought it was probably pertinent to give you a background of the number of donations and the number of donors and the number of transfusions that are happening. So in the next few slides, I'm going to tell you about what do we do and how much we use and transfuse. You can see the biggest rise in our collections has been due to the plasma collects. And there's not been much increase in our whole blood collects, but we've had to effectively double our plasma collections to keep up with the demand for IVIG, as I'm sure is what you're experiencing elsewhere. The number of platelet donations have remained the same or have dropped down, but the use of the platelets has not gone down that much, and it's reflective of our pooled platelets being made for availability and use, rather than specifically directing platelet by apheresis, and because we are more interested in collecting plasma. In the number of transfusions that we've had, you would see that we were just below 100,000 in 2018, and that has slightly creeped up in 2023. We had actually a 15 to 17% drop in the use of red cells. This has subsequently gone up. This is mixed a bit with the rise in the population that we've had, and I'll show that to you in the next few slides. The annual number of red cell recipients seems to be going up. And the number of platelet recipients is slightly increased. The number of cryo precipitate recipients has increased, and more so in the last few years, and that's reflective of our implementation of a national MHP protocol, which encourages the use of cryoprecipitate by default. So we're looking at and trying to hopefully get more of that cryoprecipitate used. What we are seeing is a small rise in the population. In fact, since I have come, I think we've gone up by 1 million. So you can see that that's not that much of a difference in the number of red cell transfusions per 1,000. The number of transfusions per 1,000 population of platelets, FFP, and also remained about the same. So what is the risk of transmission of HIV, HCV, and HBV, and what are the risk factors there? You can see from the graph that I have here that since we introduced more sensitive methods, including the individual NAT testing, our rates of hepatitis B and C have dropped dramatically. What we are seeing, though, as also a rise is in two instances. One is in OBI infections, and the other is in people who are being now coming back to us as positive for syphilis. So syphilis is seen a worldwide resurgence, and it's not just New Zealand. This is a problem that has been identified elsewhere also. So the drop in numbers was during the COVID times, when we thought that the migration had stopped and people naturally were not coming up that many numbers to donate blood. But I think the risk has primarily now focused in New Zealand on OBI and syphilis. So our look back criteria is whether it is donor triggered, whether it is patient triggered, and bacterial testing of platelet components. So we very rarely get informed about patient triggered lookbacks where there is a clinical suspicion that somebody has acquired an infection. These are few and far in between. Lookbacks are mainly donor triggered. And in brief, I will next show you our look back policy, which is our centerpiece of how we manage our look backs and the bacterial testing methods that we use to be able to track and record what has happened to the fate of each platelet component in real time. So this is the policy that we have that talks about what we do and how we do and what are the steps that we need to take. So it gets regular updated. And the last update we have is about the rationalization that we have now done with OBIs. So I'm not going to take you through this, but what essentially it says is that if the index sample that from the start of the donation process that the donor was shown to have an anti-HBsAg titer of more than 50, then we wouldn't do a clinical look back. This is because it was taking us a lot of time to go back and look and ask for samples, which we were not very successful in getting back patients in to be tested. And I'll give you an idea about the numbers that are involved here. But if it was less than 50, we would go back and test all the donors' products. So this is the appendix that goes with that. And if you would just also try to remember the last one, the syphilis serology, and see that we don't initiate a look back until there is platelet product that has been made. This is because of the risk of transmission of treponines is very small in whole blood or 4 degrees transmission or through plasma. So these are the look backs that we have done in the last 5 years, and the reasons for not performing them are also highlighted there, where there are no recipients and recipients have deceased. And there was one instance of where overseas visitor was transfused. Our HIV lookbacks have been 0. The lookbacks for the last 5 years for HCV have been 1. But as I highlighted, the occult HBV is where we are seeing a lot of numbers come up. And there have been possible cases of transmission of hepatitis B. So this is, in other words, the figures from last year. The numbers are pretty small. It's only 0.82 per 10,000 donors. And the drop in the numbers of OBI that we saw in 2021-22 was probably because of the COVID period. So let's look at bacterial testing, and again to give you an idea about how much of positivity we have. It's a true positive rate of only 0.11%, and indeterminate are the ones that we are not able to track back or don't have products left, and even then the whole thing would be just only about 0.2. This is the form that gets filled out as soon as there has been an alert. We can identify the manufacturing sites can identify the patient whom it has been transfused, and they pass on that information if to hold the unit in quarantine or transfer it back or to discard the unit, and then pass on that information to us. And these are some of my colleagues who work with. And we have another database that we go in and record as to whom the unit was transfused, whom did we speak to. And this can be in the middle of the night also, if it is a seriously positive bacteria alert system. And as I say, our systems are constantly being challenged. So really an audit it's happening almost every day, you can see. In the last instance, I'll take you on a look back case. This is a 60-year-old male donor who's only donated with us in July 2024. He's come up as very strongly positive on syphilis screen. And the reference lab results are at the bottom. You can see that he's RPR reactive in 1. So I go back into eProgesa, and you can see that he has donated twice. The current unit is from the 9th of the July, and that is both discarded. So I can see actually that both these units got discarded. And then when I click on the previous unit on the 6th of March, I can identify from this to say that it was distributed, a red cell product 04480, and that was distributed to Middlemore Hospital. Middlemore Hospital is one of the bigger hospitals in the south of Auckland region, and it doesn't in this part tell me which patient and what was the NHI. But for that, I'll have to jump into eTraceline. And when I track into eTraceline, put in the donation number, you can see 3974456 is that this was transfused on the 20th of March in hematology outpatient to a patient by this name and this NHI in the county's Manaku Hospital, which is a part of Middlemore Hospital. So we could see that in a real time, and that's a demonstration for you to be able to see that our systems work. We are a small blood service with full vein-to-vein responsibility, and I hope to have answered all the challenges raised by Paul. Would love to see if there are some more that are left. We do look backs. I can't recall when we can't trace back a unit. In fact, that creates a major incident for us, and we would be able to really get very. We'll have to send people down to the hospital to see really, where that has went. Our patient blood management team in the Waikato Hospital will go and trace everything for us. The look back policy forms the backbone. No large lookbacks have been required. The lookbacks are led by the hemovigilance coordinator under guidance of the lead TMS. There's constant review of the policy, and bacterial transfusions look back for possible bacterial contamination, as I highlighted, are done 24 hours, 365 days. 100% traceability is not a dream, but a reality here in New Zealand. So I would like to end by acknowledging our hemovigilance team, who has just published our latest report for 2023. Thank you for bearing with me. Ka kite matewa.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Deepak. Well, an excellent presentation. And I think you have a system that's probably the envy of a lot of countries, because, the ability to trace from end to end with such detail, and the data that you can also get out as well, particularly from a transfusion basis, is wonderful. There are a few questions, so we've got time for probably a couple of questions before we go to the last speaker. So does the Progesa system or the current iteration allow for information regarding patient antibodies and previous reactions?
Yes.
Okay.
So eTraceline is what we have as the current updated system, and eTraceline will hold all the information that was ever held in manual or in eProgesa. And every patient that has been transfused in New Zealand, anywhere in the country, we can trace back exactly the sample, all the findings, whom it was done by, whom it was recorded by. And that's the beauty of having one system.
Again, I think the envy of having a patient system that allows any hospital to trace any patient that they may see that's come from somewhere else. And that, I guess, answers a question that someone else was asking about the system being countrywide, which I think you've answered there. So I think if maybe we move on to the next speaker in the interest of time. So maybe, Deepak, if you can answer some of the questions online. There's 2 or 3 more questions. But in the meantime, thanks once again, and I'll hand over to Shruti, who will introduce our last speaker. Thanks, Deepak. Thanks, Shruti.
Thanks very much, Simon and Deepak. And it's been a really interesting one. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Su Brailsford. So Sue was appointed to the post of consultant in epidemiology and health protection at NHS Blood and Transplant following public health training in London. And she currently is the interim clinical director for microbiology and public health. And she has a PhD in microbiology and is a fellow of the Faculty of Public Health. She has an honorary appointment in the UK Health Security Agency, where she leads the joint unit between NHSBT and UK Health Security Agency Epidemiology Unit. They run the several surveillance programs providing data on infections and donors and recipients. Sue is also a member of SAPTO, which is the Department of Health and Social Care Expert Committee on the Safety of Blood Tissues and Organs, and is an honorary professor at the University of Nottingham. We are really grateful to Sue for coming on today on this webinar and to actually share the lessons from the Infected Blood Inquiry, which produced the report earlier this year. Over to you, Sue.
Thank you. Can you see my slides okay? Yeah, brilliant. Okay, thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to speak today. As Shruti says, I'm going to talk about the Infected Blood Inquiry, really very much from the position of NHS Blood and Transplant. Oops, dear, slides aren't moving at all now. This is not good. Let me try again. I'll stop and share again. Sorry about that. All worked so perfectly before. But...
No problem, Sue.
Let's see if we can get them to move on. Ah, there we go. So yes, so I'd just like to take a moment to remember the infected and affected and apologise on behalf of NHSBT. So I'm just going to give a little background to the Infected Blood Inquiry, overview of the recommendations, focusing on some of the broader issues, and then finish up really with thinking about microbiology then and now. As you're probably aware, the Infected Blood Inquiry was set up to really look at the transmissions of infections in the 1970s and 80s, mainly of hepatitis C and HIV, but also other infections from blood products and blood transfusions. Now, there had been 2 previous inquiries, the Archer inquiry in England towards the end, around 2007, but this was a privately funded inquiry, so it wasn't statutory. And then this was followed by the Penrose inquiry, which was really a Scottish inquiry, had statutory powers, but couldn't demand people came and gave evidence from countries outside of Scotland. And in the case of the Penrose inquiry, it really only made one recommendation, which was around people who had received a transfusion prior to 1991 should have a test for hepatitis C. So neither of these inquiries really got to the nub of the problem. And those people infected and affected really didn't think either of these inquiries were particularly well done. So in 2017, the Infected Blood Inquiry was announced by the government in Westminster. This was to be independent and statutory inquiry chaired by Sir Brian Longstaff, who had been a High Court judge, and this commenced in September 2018. So it had a very wide scope. So it was to cover the whole of the UK. In terms of the people who had been affected, that was kind of going to be in the thousands. The time frame was to focus in the 70s and 80s, but really this went as far back as when the blood service was established. And in some cases, there was evidence going back much earlier than the 1970s. And really, there was a commitment from the outset for the affected and infected to be at the heart of the inquiry. So this was likely to take a number of years. It probably took slightly longer than expected because of COVID. Terms of references were set up, and there was a living document that was really a list of issues. And by the end of the inquiry, this had got to 500 plus lists of issues that were to be investigated. So the principles were that the infected and affected should be heard. And Sir Brian set out to do this by hearing from these people right at the beginning of the inquiry and also at the close of the inquiry. There was to be thoroughness, respect. There's a real push that this should be open and transparent, very independent, and it should take a listening approach throughout. So from an NHS point of view, we submitted a lengthy report from our Chief Medical Officer, which basically covered the history and organisation of what was the English Blood Service with its various iterations. We waived professional privilege. We made our archive available to the inquiry, which was some 95,000 boxes of information. The inquiry also had access to some of our electronic records and were very keen to interrogate our systems. And we also had a large number of current and now retired employees who gave verbal evidence to the inquiry. And the other UK blood services took a similar approach. So the inquiry report was published on the 20th of May this year. And it was a very emotional day, actually. There was kind of memorial, and there was Sir Brian basically gave a précis of the report, and then there was various presentations from a number of people. But the general feeling was that the infected and affected were very approving of the final report, thought he had done a good job. Were very keen that the recommendations were actually taken forward and put into place. So the final report is available online, and also the overall day and ceremony as well. So the inquiry really, in terms of, I had mentioned this was a large scope, so these are the kind of numbers we were thinking of. I'm going to focus mainly on the blood transfusion side, where it's estimated that there were almost 30,000 people who were affected, and around 3,000 people who died because of infected blood or blood products. So in terms of the recommendations, there were 12 recommendations in total. There we go. The ones in bold are the ones really that I'm going to focus on, but there were some other recommendations. The first one was around compensation for people affected and infected. There had been compensation or clinical claim schemes in the UK, but these hadn't always worked particularly well, and in most cases it relied on people being able to access their transfusion records and show that they didn't have another source of their infection. So compensation has recently been announced. There's still quite a lot of work going on to work through that. It's also learning from the inquiry that the records from the inquiry should be kept online. And also there were a number of other points around the civil service and government, and really changes that should be made there. There was a specific recommendation around haemophilia care, which I'm not really going to go into, and also around how responses should be made to inquiries, and how recommendations from inquiries should be put into place. So, specific recommendations. One of the main ones was around the role of the blood services in education, particularly medical education, although obviously this extends to everybody involved in transfusion. and how really the findings that are still going to remain online should be used for this purpose, really, so that people remember what happened, the issues of the past in terms of not acting quick enough, not being able to trace people, and so that these are really used going forward in medical education and that wider education piece. There was recommendation 4 was around preventing future harms, and Sir Brian throughout the report did talk about cost and how cost should not be the main factor. Obviously, it's important, but it was very much about putting safety as really the first thing that you should be thinking about, and moving towards a safety culture. One of the things that was mentioned here and also in other recent inquiries in the UK was around a more rational approach to regulation and safety management. We have a large number of regulators, and many inquiries have now come to the same opinion that this should be reduced, so that there's not a whole lot of people trying to regulate the same organisations. There was also a comment about the coherent approach to data. So I acknowledge that there was quite a lot of data, but this isn't always used in the right way, and also often individual countries weren't looking sort of wider than their own data. So throughout the report, it talks about cultural change, about moving away from defensiveness, about being more open and transparent, and also specifically about the duty of candour, which is kind of in law in England, but that to be extended across the UK, and not just to the clinical workforce, but to be extended to those in management and leadership positions. So in terms of the safety culture, specific points raised were around the need to invest to save, very much a public health model, rather looking to the long term. As I mentioned, this national approach to regulation and safety. There was also comment about protective measures should be introduced as soon as possible, rather than sort of waiting for more data. And again, this whole issue to a coherent approach to data and using data to trend what's going on, not just within one individual blood services, but looking across the whole of the UK and more widely. So not surprisingly, record keeping and destruction policies was another thing that came up within this safety framework. There were a number of people who were unable to find their transfusion records. Some of these and sort of wider medical records was because of destruction policies not being clear. And certainly where hospitals had closed, there had been a number of accidental disposals. So it made it really difficult to carry out lookbacks. But also inaccurate medical records. Sometimes there were inappropriate comments in some of these medical records, which obviously was hopefully of the time. Hopefully that sort of thing doesn't happen now. But one of the main recommendations was around digitisation of records, and a recommendation that a formal audit of medical records should be carried out by the end of 2027. And also there was a comment about funding should be in place for digitisation where it's not available. So recommendation 7 was specifically around blood transfusion. It's focused a lot on tranexamic acid and alternatives to transfusion. But also there were a number of recommendations that were put forward by ISBT and the other blood services around training, adequate staffing in laboratories. There was a comment about how the recommendations that were made by SHOT, the UK Haemovigilance System, should be ensured that these were implemented. And also, quite importantly, in terms of what we've been talking about today, establishing the outcome of every transfusion. And again, this links in with the digitisation. Recommendation 8 was about finding undiagnosed people. There was some advice that people registering with GPs should be have a test for blood-borne infections if they say that they've had a transfusion in the past. This is very much led by the UK Health Security Agency. also, there was recommendations that people who have been transfused earlier than 1996 should have a test for hepatitis C. There was some debate about that date, but that's the date that was recommended. And obviously, in some small way, as the blood services, we take our part in carrying out look back and post-transfusion infection investigations. Recommendation 10 was important around giving patients a voice, particularly how lobby groups and charities should be given funding to support patients, but also more widely the issues of shared decision making, consent and information ahead of transfusions. And really points were made that people were falsely reassured and were not given adequate information to give informed consent. It's also acknowledged throughout the report that really there was a lack of understanding of risk, and therefore this really, people couldn't talk about risk to patients and potentially wider family members. As part of giving patients a voice, the report recommended that a yellow card scheme should be set up. So in a similar way to medicines are reported in the UK, this would allow individual patients to report if they had an adverse reaction from a transfusion. But I think recommendation 10 really raises the importance of involving donors, patients and the wider public in both policy decisions and changes, and also in research more widely. One of the issues that came up time and again was delays in introducing testing. So particularly with the hepatitis C tests, the UK and Republic of Ireland were one of the last countries to introduce hepatitis C. And then once this was introduced, there was another 4 years before we actually started the look back. So obviously that made it quite difficult to be able to identify all of those recipients affected because records had been lost. There was also some issues around how long it took to get some of the information out around AIDS leaflets, and also noted that there was more concern about adverse publicity than getting these out rapidly. But again, a lot of this was about waiting for that perfect answer, where science kind of became a bit more important sometimes than actually getting on and putting some precautionary measures in place. And again, when it came to risks, really whether that we were too slow to act because we were looking for certainty rather than just going with the knowledge that we already had. And part of this really also there was mention about investment into the wider public health and that horizon scanning activity for those infections sort of coming over the hill. And again, in terms of risk, there was acknowledgement of, although there was data, really data was collected, but there wasn't enough actually done with this data to work out what was going on. So some of the wide issues relating to the government and the civil service and sort of management more generally, it was acknowledged that at this time the blood services were quite fragmented. There was not national services in each of the 4 UK nations, which really didn't help in terms of making decisions. But there was also within the civil service and government, it was noted that there was some defensive-ness, that there was some groupthink going on, that it was quite difficult for people to challenge things. And this really led to the same lines being put out again and again, that there really wasn't an issue. And I think some of these issues about failure to learn really came up again in the COVID inquiry. So it's the importance of leadership and remembering what happened in the past and learning those lessons. So there was a range of general comments that affected everybody in healthcare, not just in transfusion community. There's the role of data, using it properly, and digitising records in healthcare was front and centre really. There's some specific issues around transfusion. a number of comments around wider public health measures and why they're important, but also around how civil service and government should act in terms of inquiries. But having said all of that, that all kind of sounds quite bad. It was acknowledged that things have moved on greatly. Now we have a number of systems in place to horizon scan. We have SABTO, which is government expert committee that use the ABO risk decision-making framework. JPAC oversees transfusion guidelines in the UK. We now do have much better data systems. And then obviously we have shots and surveillance across the UK, and in England more recently, we have new systems in place for investigating serious incidents. It really is a case of having all of these bits of the jigsaw to link up, as we've heard earlier about look-back investigations and how important they are, really just to make sure that we haven't got a recurring problem going on. So really it's important that we have the right data, analyze it properly, and we share this widely. And just really to bring us up to date where we are in the UK, the Joint Epidemiology Unit that runs between NHSBT and the UK Health Security Agency was set up at around the same time as SHOT in the UK. And over time, we've seen a number of changes in terms of donor selection criteria, but also in terms of the epidemiology of HIV and Hep C, hepatitis B to some extent. But alongside the major changes in testing technologies, how blood is used, and also how that impacts on the overall risk from transfusions. So as testing's improved, the window periods have reduced, and therefore the risk of transmission of a bloodborne infection has also decreased over time. So it's relatively rare for us to have transfusion transmitted infections in the UK, but they do still occur. But I think these days we are able to spot them and investigate them much more quickly than we could have done in the past. So what's happening now in terms of the IBI? All of the 4 UK nations have their own individual plans, but they all are working together as part of the UK forum. SABTO are looking at their role in safety to see if there's other things that they should be doing. And all of these groups have an overarching Department of Health and Social Care group, which will report to government and will also work with the other countries in the UK to report back. So Brian really wanted a report back to him in 12 months' time, 12 months post-May this year, with an expectation that the recommendations would be put in place. And if they weren't to be put in place, then why not? So I think that may be delayed because of our new government, but that work is ongoing. There is a link there for NHSBT, so you can see what we're doing in terms of our response to the IBI. Just want to acknowledge colleagues who have been working on the IBI for the last 6 years, and also those infected and affected who gave evidence to the inquiry. And just to leave you with a thought, which is very important, that we don't get complacent that we have infection sorted, because there'll always be something coming over the hill. So thank you very much, and that's me done.
Thanks very much, Sue. And that is a comprehensive overview and really lots of learning that is not just applicable for UK, but across the world as well. So thank you for sharing that. There's no specific question related to the infected blood inquiry, but there are a couple of questions which I would welcome both yours as well as other panelists as well. So we have one question that says, do you look back for malaria?
We will if it's somebody who has malarial DNA. So we have had a small number of cases where, so our routine test is for antibodies, but also we will test for DNA in certain cases. And we have last year had a transmission, which is, well, the first one we've had in 20 odd years, I think. So in the case where a donor has malarial DNA, then we would look back. That would be quite rare because most people probably would be first-time donors. There's only one occurrence I can think of where it was a regular donor who was a visitor who had been treated, who had taken antimalarials, had done everything that you should have done as a donor, and then developed malaria a few months later. So we did in that case.
Thank you, Sue. And another question, I think Erica is actually on the call from Australia, and she's actually asked, could you expand a bit more on how to ensure the outcome of every transfusion, not just that it occurred, but the outcome for the patient? And I can add a bit as well. So I can kick off if you want to, but you can.
Yes, I think that might be a good idea.
Yeah, thanks, Erica. I think I knew that you would be asking a challenging one, but I think at present, because there are various ways that we can actually look at the transfusion outcomes as to it is not just how the patient felt or had any reaction or not, but it's only a small proportion which may result in a reaction. But we're also actually then seeing about, is this actually an increment in the underlying parameter of the full blood count, whether it is achieved the relevant hemoglobin outcome. So currently where we are is we are having some discussions at the UK level so that we agree what are the outcomes that we all will be agreeing to, and then see how that can be operationalized across the UK. So that is where we are, because there are different aspects of the outcome, whether it is patient-reported outcome measures as well, whether that is what we want to actually then capture. So, but I'll keep you posted. Thanks, Erica. And over to you. So if you wanted to add anything to that.
Well, it's a challenge, isn't it? Yeah, and I think this is probably not quite the answer to the question, but I think the issue for us, obviously, we can generally trace really well with what we've issued to what hospital, and then we often contacting the clinical team, particularly for query bacterial transmissions, where we've had bacterial screening, reactivity, and it's already gone out and been transfused. And then it's often really hard because if nothing's happened, it's generally not recorded. So you're relying on the clinical team to try and find somebody who knows Mrs. X who had this transfusion. So I think if we're able to improve things at that end, that would be really useful.
That's great. Thanks, Sue. I think we are in the last 2 minutes. So I think there is another question in the chat if you would like to actually answer that. But before handing over to Simon, I just wanted to actually share some information about another upcoming event as well. So we have a free RCPATH. This is a biennial conference of advances in transfusion. I hope you can see my screen, and there is a QR code there that will take you to the registration page. This is again a free 2 half-a-day event as a webinar over Zoom. So please feel free. This is actually about advances in transfusion and a joint program delivered by Royal College of Pathologists as well as SHOT. And with that, again, I thank Sue, and I'll pass you on to Simon, and I'll stop sharing.
Right. Thanks, Shruti, and thanks to all our 3 speakers for their excellent presentations, which I hope very much you enjoyed, and it shows the breadth and importance of traceability in a number of aspects. I also want to acknowledge the excellent support provided to the seminar by Raquel Lopez and Darren Hall from SHOT, who have looked after us and helped put the meeting together, and also in the background looking after keeping the Zoom meeting running smoothly. I should also mention that the IHN Seminar Committee is already planning for our next webinar, which we hope to hold in the Northern Hemisphere spring sometime around March or April next year. So we're just currently sort of tossing around a few ideas for that. And also, before you go, we would like to invite you to complete our brief online poll just to get some feedback from you about your attendance in the webinar and some of those things that you might want to see from us in the future. So if you've got a few moments to complete that. Otherwise, once again, thanks to you for joining. Thanks for the excellent questions. Thanks very much to Shruti, Barbie, for supporting me as well as the seminar committee. And thanks, I suppose, primarily to the 3 speakers.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.